Hi, this is Heidi Strelo. I'm doing a psychoanalytic theory of personality PowerPoint in Dr. Good's class for models of personality. The contents of my PowerPoint include the main ideas of each theorist, the perspective of each author, an evaluation on effectiveness of each of the articles, and then I'm going to compare and contrast the two articles and the two theories. First up, we have Gordon Allpott's theory. One thing that Allpott believed is that human beings were motivated, had the tendency to satisfy biological survival needs, and this is what they were motivated by, and he referred to this as opportunistic functioning, which is the tendency to satisfy biological needs, which looks like reactive, past-oriented, and biological. And next, he felt that opportunistic functioning was relatively unimportant in understanding most of human behavior. So Allpott felt human behavior was motivated more in a manner expressive of ourselves, which he called appropriate functioning, which looks future-oriented and psychological. Next, we have the theory continued. Propriate, the proprium, which is Allpott's name for the essential concept of the self, which is ourselves as experience, the aspects we see as essential. First, the functional definition is that the self has 7 functions. Sorry, I got to go back here. That the self has 7 functions. There is number 1, our sense of body, which usually develops within the first 2 years of life. It has boundaries that pain and injury, touch and movement make us aware of. And number 2 is self-identity, which also develops in the first 2 years. We see ourselves as individual entities, separate and different from others, and this is our self-identity. Number 3, self-esteem, which develops between 2 and 4 years old. There comes a time when we recognize that we have value to others and to ourselves, and this is our self-esteem. Number 4, self-extension, which he believed developed between the ages of 4 and 6. And certain things, people, and events around us also come to be thought of as central and warm, essential to my existence. Some people define themselves in terms of their parents, their spouse, or their children, or their community or nation. And then some people find their identity in activities. And we have number 6, which is rational coping. And he believed that this happened in the years from ages 6 to 12, when the child begins to develop his or her abilities to deal with life's problems rationally and effectively. And number 7, appropriate striving, which he believed didn't usually begin until after 12 years of age. And this is yourself as goals, ideals, plans, vocations, callings, a sense of direction, and a sense of purpose. Next, we have Gordon Allpott's theory of traits. He believed we had personal traits or dispositions that were concrete and easily recognized consistencies in our behavior. Allpott believed that traits are unique to each individual. And he also thought that within any culture there are common traits that each individual culture shares that is part of that culture. And then he believed there were central traits which were more closely tied to yourself or oneself, and secondary traits which were preferences, attitudes, and situational. And then he thought there were cardinal traits, which he thought these particularly defined our lives. Someone who spends their life seeking fame or fortune, for example, is such a person. For example, Mother Teresa, Machiavelli, and so on. Relatively few people develop cardinal traits, and if they do, he believed they did it later in life. And then we have Allport's main ideas continued. He believed that psychological maturity is attained if you have a well-developed proprium and a rich adaptive set of dispositions. And he believed the 7 characteristics of psychological maturity were: number 1, extension of self, which was involvement in life and activities and relationships. And number 2, warm relating, to be able to relate to others with trust, empathy, genuine tolerance. And number 3, emotional security, being secure in ourselves and accepting, self-acceptance of ourselves. And number 4, realistic perception, habits of realistic perception, as opposed to defensiveness, being able to see yourself realistically and be able to laugh at yourself. And number 5, problem-centeredness and the development of problem-solving skills. Number 6, self-objectification, insight into one's own behavior. To be able to look into yourself and see what you need to work on, or the ability to correct that. And number 7, a unifying philosophy of life, including a particular value orientation and a differentiated religious sentiment and a personalized conscience. And the conclusion of Allport's theory was he didn't believe looking too much into a person's past to understand his present, and this belief was most strongly evident in his concept of functional autonomy, which had 2 flavors. Number 1 being percevative functional autonomy, and this he referred to as habits, behaviors that no longer serve their original purpose, but they continue anyway. And number 2, appropriate functional autonomy, and he believed this is more self-directed than habits. Values, for example, are that doesn't in any way detract from your well-known generosity. For example, if you were selfish when you were a child, it has become your value. And now we move on to Erik Erikson's theory. According to Erikson, the environment in which a child lives is crucial to providing growth, adjustment, and a source of self-awareness and identity. Erikson's life stage virtues had 8 stages. He believed that a crisis can occur at each stage of development involving the differences of an individual against the needs of society. Successful completion of each stage, he believed, resulted in a healthy personality and a gaining of basic virtues, versus, if this didn't happen, failure to complete these stages results in reduced ability to move to further stages and led to unhealthy personality and a sense of self. Erikson's 8 stages were: number 1, hope, basic trust versus basic mistrust, which were from ages newborn to 1. And number 2, will and autonomy versus shame, which was 1 to 3 years of age. Number 3, purpose and initiative versus guilt, which was preschool age, 3 to 6 years. 4, competence, industry versus inferiority, which were around the school ages of 6 to 11 years. Let's see, number 5 was fidelity and identity versus role confusion, which happened around adolescent ages 12 to 18. And number 6, love, intimacy versus isolation, first stage of adult development, ages 18 to 35. And number 7, care and generativity versus stagnation, which were ages 35 to 64. And last stage was wisdom, ego integrity versus despair. And this was from ages 65 and on. And now we're taking a look at the author's perspectives. Allport was one of those theorists that was so right about so many things. He was one of the first humanistic theories. An unfortunate aspect in his original use of the word trait, though, angered situationally oriented behaviorists. Erikson's development of identity seemed to be one of his greatest concerns in life. Erikson was ranked 12th most cited psychologist of the 20th century, and even though Erikson lacked a bachelor's degree, he worked as a professor at Yale and Harvard. And in looking at the effectiveness of the articles, my positives were that both articles were very effective because they covered background histories, personal lives, experience, training, and theories, but the negative were the articles could have touched on comparisons against other theories. Both theorists had an optimistic view of human nature, and they both believed hereditary and environment play a role in personality development. Allport had no clear range of personality between childhood and adulthood. Erikson thought that his theory on stages allowed for the development of basic strengths that emerged from adaptive ways of coping with conflict. Erikson had 8 successive stages of life, and they were interrelated. Erikson was credited for being one of the first ego psychologists, and Erikson recognized the impact on personality of cultural and historical forces. Gordon Allport was considered a trait psychologist. Allport believed personality was guided more by present and future than the past, and Allport emphasized the uniqueness of the individual. And that's the end of my PowerPoint presentation. I realize it was a little long. I apologize for that.